Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast, everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive into a story that really makes you think about the state of modern media. You know, Jim Acosta, the CNN anchor, made a dramatic exit recently, and we're going to unpack all the layers of that event.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this one resignation has sparked so much discussion about CNN, about Donald Trump, and about media bias as a whole.
Okay, so for our listeners who maybe don't remember every single detail, let's rewind to that dramatic moment. Acosta resigning live on air, refusing to give in to the lies. What a way to go outright.
It was definitely a statement. And to fully grasp the weight of it, we need to consider the context. Remember, this wasn't just a random anchor. Acosta was known for his very direct and often confrontational approach when covering the Trump administration.
Yeah, you're right. He wasn't afraid to push back on claims to fact-check in real time. That made him a target for criticism, but also earned him a loyal following.
Exactly. And that dynamic, that tension between Acosta and the Trump administration really set the stage for his eventual departure.
So let's talk about the lead-up to that resignation. Our sources mentioned that CNN offered Acosta a new time slot, midnight. Quite a change from his high-profile 10 a.m. slot.
Yeah, it's hard not to see that as a demotion, a way to potentially minimize his visibility. And Acosta himself seemed to interpret it that way.
I mean, I can see how that would feel like a sidelining.
Yeah.
Especially after he had become such a prominent voice on the network. But what was CNN's official reason for the time slot change? Do they offer any public explanation?
It's interesting. Our sources don't really dive into CNN's side of the story in detail. The focus is primarily on Acosta's perspective, his feeling that the network was more concerned with appeasing Trump than with supporting his journalism.
That's a pretty serious accusation. It implies that corporate interests, maybe even a fear of backlash from the Trump administration, might have influenced editorial decisions at CNN.
Yeah, it does raise that question, doesn't it? And this is where it gets really interesting. For anyone who cares about the integrity of news.
Before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I want to bring up something that surprised me as I was prepping for this deep dive. Acosta's most memorable moment at CNN, at least according to him, wasn't actually related to Trump at all.
Oh, you're talking about his interview with Raul Castro in Cuba, right?
Yeah.
He brought it up during his resignation speech?
Yes. It was during Obama's visit to Cuba, and Acosta had the chance to ask Castro about political prisoners. It's a reminder that Acosta's career, his passion for journalism, extends far beyond just the Trump era.
Absolutely. It adds a layer of complexity to his story. This wasn't just a reporter chasing controversy. This was a journalist who had covered international affairs, who challenged leaders from different political backgrounds.
Right. It paints a more complete picture of who Acosta is, beyond the sound bites and headlines. And it makes his criticisms of CNN, his accusations of appeasing Trump, all the more intriguing.
Because it suggests these concerns were coming from a place of experience, from someone who had seen how journalistic integrity could be compromised, perhaps even firsthand.
Okay, so let's get back to those accusations. Acosta felt that CNN was kissing the ring and trying to appease Trump. What evidence does he or do our sources present to back up that claim?
Well, one key piece of evidence they point to is the language used in certain CNN headlines during Trump's presidency.
You mean like the one our source highlights? Trump's frenetic pace delivers on early promises, but tests lie ahead. That does seem pretty measured, considering the controversy surrounding some of those early actions.
Exactly. And that's the point the source is making. The argument is that CNN was downplaying, or at least not fully acknowledging, the potentially negative implications of some of Trump's policies and actions.
It's like they were trying to walk this tightrope, reporting on what was happening without directly criticizing or antagonizing the administration.
Yeah, and, there's a debate to be had about whether that's responsible journalism, whether that's truly holding power accountable, or whether it's a form of self-censorship driven by fear or a desire to maintain access.
That's such a great point. It makes you wonder if this alleged bias at CNN was an isolated incident or part of a broader trend in media. Were other outlets behaving similarly during the Trump era?
Our sources definitely suggest that this wasn't unique to CNN. They point to a number of other examples that raise similar concerns about potential bias and the influence of corporate interests on news coverage.
Give us some specifics. What are some of the other cases they highlight?
Well, there's the case of ABC settling with Trump for a whopping $15 million, potentially related to their coverage of sexual assault allegations against him. Then there's CBS potentially settling over not including certain footage of Kamala Harris on 60 Minutes.
And let's not forget the New York Times. Our sources call out specific headlines that seem to downplay Trump's actions, even on issues like abortion after he appointed judges who overturned Roe v. Wade.
It does seem like there's a pattern emerging here, a potential trend of media outlets, particularly those with strong corporate ties, being cautious, maybe even hesitant, to fully challenge or criticize powerful figures like Trump.
Before we go any further, I want to remind everyone listening to like, subscribe, and share this episode. You can find the Allison Knows podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We really appreciate your support, and it helps us reach a wider audience. Now back to our deep dive. This trend of potential media bias we're seeing, it's pretty unsettling, right?
It is, and it's not just unsettling, it's dangerous. Because when the media, the very institutions we rely on to inform us and hold power accountable, start to bend to outside pressure, it erodes public trust. It makes it harder to distinguish fact from fiction, truth from spin.
Absolutely. And that erosion of trust, that feeling that you can't rely on the information you're getting, it can have a ripple effect throughout society.
Yeah.
It can fuel polarization, undermine democratic processes, and ultimately make it harder to address the complex challenges we face.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to scrutinize media coverage, to demand transparency and accountability from those who hold the megaphone. We can't just passively consume information. We need to be active, critical thinkers.
I'm with you on that. And on that note, I think it's time for a quick break before we continue this fascinating discussion.
It's interesting how this entire conversation keeps circling back to this question of accountability. It seems like that's the common thread connecting Acosta's resignation, the criticisms of mainstream media, and even the promotion of those independent outlets like the Midas Touch Network, which we'll get into a bit later.
Yeah, you're right. There's this underlying tension between those who think the media should just report the facts and those who believe the media has a responsibility to actively hold power accountable, even if that means expressing opinions or taking a more critical stance. Where do you land on that spectrum?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think it's less about picking a side and more about recognizing that journalism exists on a spectrum. Some outlets lean towards straight reporting, while others embrace a more analytical, opinion-driven approach. The key, in my view, is transparency. Be upfront about your approach, your potential biases, and let the audience decide how much weight to give your reporting.
Transparency is key, especially in the age of social media, where information and misinformation spreads like wildfire.
It's like we're all drinking from this fire hose of information, and it's hard to know what to trust, which I think makes deep dives like this one so valuable. We can slow down, take a closer look at a specific event like Acosta's resignation, and start to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's like we're putting on our detective hats, examining the clues, and trying to piece together what really happened. And in this case, the clues seem to point to some potential issues with media bias and corporate influence.
Right. And while it's easy to get caught up in the specifics of Acosta's story, I think it's important to zoom out and think about the broader implications. What does this tell us about the state of our media landscape? What does it mean for you as a consumer of news?
That's a good pivot point if we zoom out and look at the whole media landscape. Is this potential bias we're seeing with CNN an isolated incident, or is this something bigger?
Based on the sources we have, it seems like there's a broader trend at play. Remember those other examples we discussed? ABC settling with Trump CBS potentially editing out footage of Kamala Harris. These cases, along with the criticisms of the New York Times, suggest that there might be a systemic issue.
It almost makes you wonder if certain media outlets, especially those owned by large corporations, are more susceptible to pressure from powerful individuals or entities. And maybe they're worried about legal battles, losing access, or facing backlash that could impact their bottom line.
That's a valid concern, and it raises questions about whether corporate ownership and the pursuit of profit might be compromising journalistic integrity in some cases.
So if the mainstream media is potentially compromised, where do we turn for reliable information? Our source material seems to suggest that independent media might be the answer. Specifically, they point to this Midas Touch Network.
Yes, they even went so far as to offer Acosta a job on air. Now, it's important to note that we don't have much information about the Midas Touch Network. We don't know who funds them, what their editorial standards are, or how they operate.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Just because they label themselves as independent and pro-democracy doesn't automatically mean they're immune to bias or manipulation.
Exactly. Every media outlet, regardless of size or funding, comes with its own set of perspectives and potential blind spots.
So it sounds like the takeaway here isn't necessarily to abandon mainstream media and flock to independent outlets. It's more about being a savvy consumer of information, no matter where it comes from.
I think that's a really smart way to put it. Be skeptical, be critical.
Right.
Don't just accept what you're told at face value. Do your own research, compare different sources, and form your own informed opinions.
And on that note, I want to remind everyone to like, subscribe, and share this episode. It really helps us spread the word and continue these important conversations. You can find the Allison Knows podcast on Spotify and YouTube. Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more thing that really stood out in our source material, this Project 2025 that they kept mentioning.
Yes, Project 2025. This is where things get a little, well, ominous. Essentially, it's a blueprint, a political strategy document created by conservative groups outlining a plan for a potential future Trump administration should he be reelected in 2024.
So it's basically a roadmap for how a second Trump term might unfold in terms of policy changes, appointments, and overall governance.
Exactly. And what makes this so fascinating, so concerning for some, is that it's incredibly detailed. It goes beyond broad strokes and lays out specific actions, targets for deregulation, potential executive orders, and even personnel recommendations.
It's almost like they're anticipating a Trump victory and preparing to hit the ground running with a ready-made agenda.
That's the impression I got as well. And what's particularly interesting is the source material's criticism of how the media has covered, or perhaps more accurately, undercovered this project.
Yeah, they seem to argue that Project 2025 deserves more attention, more scrutiny, particularly given Trump's initial disavowal of the project during his campaign, followed by what appears to be his tacit approval now.
Yes. They suggest that media outlets should have been more vocal in challenging Trump on this apparent flip-flop, holding him accountable for potentially misleading voters about his stance on the project.
It raises the question of whether the media has been doing enough to dig deeper into this project, to analyze its potential implications, and to inform the public about what a second Trump term might look like based on this roadmap laid out by his supporters. Is definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. And it ties back to our earlier conversation about media bias and accountability. If Project 2025 is as significant as our source material suggests, then it's crucial that the media provides comprehensive, unbiased coverage of it, allowing voters to make informed decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about Acosta's resignation, the criticisms of mainstream media, the rise of independent outlets, and this looming presence of Project 2025. It's a lot to process. What are some key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
I think the biggest takeaway is this: be an active, engaged consumer of information. Don't just passively absorb what you're told, question everything, think critically, consider multiple perspectives. And most importantly, don't be afraid to dig deeper, to seek out information beyond the headlines and sound bites.
I couldn't agree more. This whole conversation has really highlighted the importance of media literacy in today's world. We need to be able to navigate this complex information landscape, to separate fact from fiction, and to form our own informed opinions.
And it's not just about being informed, it's about being engaged, hold media outlets accountable, demand transparency, support quality journalism, and most importantly, participate in the conversation. Share your thoughts, your insights, and your questions.
Those are excellent points. And speaking of participation, I want to remind everyone once again to like, subscribe, and share this episode. It really helps us reach a wider audience and keep these important discussions going. You can find us on Spotify and YouTube. So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from Acosta's resignation to the broader issues of media bias, and even this whole Project 2025 thing. It feels like we've opened up a Pandora's box of questions about the role of media in our society.
Yeah, it's true. There are no easy answers when it comes to these complex issues, but I think the conversation we've been having points to a few key principles that can help you navigate this information landscape.
Okay, so what are some actionable takeaways our listeners can walk away with?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the importance of being a discerning consumer of information. Don't just blindly accept everything you read or hear. Question sources, consider motives, and look for evidence to support claims.
So you're basically saying we all need to become media detectives in a way, right?
Exactly. Put on your critical thinking cap, and don't be afraid to dig a little deeper, cross-reference information, check out different perspectives, and try to understand the context behind the news you're consuming.
And how can we apply that detective mindset to the specific concerns we've been discussing? Like, for example, how do we assess whether a media outlet is potentially biased?
That's a great question. One thing you can look for is patterns in their coverage. Are they consistently framing certain issues or individuals in a particular light? Do they seem to favor certain sources or viewpoints over others?
It's about looking beyond the surface and noticing subtle cues in the language, the tone, the choice of experts they interview. It's like learning to read between the lines.
It really is. And remember, no media outlet is perfectly objective. Everyone has a perspective, a set of values that influences the way they see the world. The key is to be aware of those potential biases so you can take them into account when evaluating the information you're getting.
So it's about recognizing that there's no such thing as pure news. There's always a human element involved, a lens through which the information is filtered.
That's a really important point, and it's why it's so crucial to diversify your media diet. Don't just stick to one or two sources. Seek out different perspectives, even those you might disagree with.
It's like that saying, you are what you eat. But in this case, it's you are what you read, watch, and listen to. So choose your media consumption wisely.
I love that analogy. And speaking of media consumption, let's circle back to this idea of independent media. Our source materials seemed pretty enthusiastic about outlets like the Midas Touch Network, but we also acknowledge that they come with their own set of potential biases.
So how do we evaluate independent media, knowing that they might not have the same resources or accountability structures as larger established outlets?
That's where critical thinking becomes even more important with independent media. It's crucial to look closely at their funding sources, their editorial processes, and their track record.
It's about doing your homework, essentially investigating who's behind the information you're receiving and what their motivations might be.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Reach out to the outlet directly if you have concerns about their reporting. Transparency should be a two-way street.
Transparency and accountability, those seem to be the recurring themes in this whole conversation about media and journalism.
They really are. And ultimately, the responsibility for ensuring those principles are upheld rests not just on the shoulders of journalists and media organizations, but also on us, the consumers of information.
We have a role to play in shaping the media landscape. We can choose to support outlets that prioritize accuracy and integrity. We can demand more transparency from those in power, and we can engage in constructive dialogue even when it's difficult.
Well said. It's about recognizing that the media is not some separate entity operating in a vacuum. It's a reflection of us, of our society, and it's shaped by our choices and actions.
Thinking back to Acosta's decision to resign, I'm struck by the courage it took for him to stand up for his principles, even if it meant walking away from a high-profile position.
It was definitely a bold move, and regardless of whether you agree with his assessment of CNN or his style of journalism, his actions sparked an important conversation about the challenges facing the media today.
And that's what I find so compelling about this whole story.
Yeah.
It's not just about one man's career trajectory. It's about the broader fight for truth, accountability, and a media landscape that serves the public interest.
Yeah, it's a fight that's far from over. In fact, it's more important now than ever before. As we move further into this age of information overload, it's going to become even more crucial to be vigilant, to be informed, and to be engaged citizens.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of these complex issues, but I hope our listeners have come away with a better understanding of the challenges facing the media today and the role they can play in shaping a more informed and engaged society.
I agree. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep demanding better from the media we consume.
Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode. You can find this on Spotify and YouTube. And be sure to follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok. Until next time, stay curious.